The next speaker is Carl-Johan Olsson, who is curator of 19th century painting at the Nationalmuseum in Stockholm. Carl-Johan was also formerly an education officer at the New Carlsberg Glyptotek and the National Gallery of Denmark and the Archimuseum of Modern Art, all in Copenhagen. Carl-Johan Olsson has a particular interest in European landscape painting and the philosophy of art of romanticism and in artistic life in Sweden in the 19th century Sweden. In recent years, he has curated exhibitions such as The Traveler's Gaze, Profession Artist, and Carl Larsson, L'Imagier de la Suède at the Petit Palais in Paris, together with Torsten Gunnarsson and Christophe Leribaud. And I would also like to add that Carl-Johan is an inspirational colleague and a great enthusiast for romantic art. So I think it's very exciting to hear you exploring on Balke's relation to his teacher Fahlcrantz and his time in Sweden. Thank you. The stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Knut, for those very kind words. Thank you also for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. And I am happy to get the opportunity to travel with Carl-Johan Fahlcrantz all this way from Sweden. I wish I could have told him. I'm doing that right now. My intention is to introduce you to Carl-Johan Fahlcrantz, once the greatest landscape painter of Sweden, but since the late, I'm just going to my timer, sorry. But since late 19th century, as good as forgotten. Strangely, very little is known about Fahlcrantz, who has been characterized as invisible in archives. And my ambition has been to study his paintings and reflect on his place in the oeuvre of Peder Balke. And Balke is today considered a visionary, a genius, whereas Fahlcrantz is considered repetitive and boring. Of course, there is some truth to that, but it's not entirely fair. Comparing the two artists has been interesting, not least since features of Balke's paintings have made me see features of Fahlcrantz paintings in a different way, and hopefully more people will. Carl-Johan Fahlcrantz's first professor was the decorative painter at the Royal Theatre in Stockholm, Per Emanuel Limnell, from the year 1792. Curiously, this year marks the end of an era, as the king, Gustavus III, was murdered on March 29th. Along with him also died a patronage of the arts that had been solid for more than half a century, resulting in a golden age of Swedish art and architecture, namely the Gustavian era. The following half century has often been referred to as the dark age of Swedish art. Perhaps not a good way to begin this talk, but it's not as dark as it may sound. But however, I think this is not entirely fair, and part of an explanation of this harsh judgment is that Denmark, our neighbor, experienced its golden age parallel to this, producing a blending art, making it difficult for the afterworld to see Swedish art in its own right. In several senses, the first half of the 19th century is an interesting period in Swedish art history. In 1809, the son of Gustavus III, Gustavus IV, was dethroned and replaced by his uncle, Charles XIII. As you know, Charles XIII had no children, and to solve this, one of Napoleon's closest allies and Marshal of France, Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, was elected heir presumptive in 1810. He took the name Carl-Johan, and in 1818 he became the King of Norway and Sweden. This was the beginning of a new dynasty, and this, of course, called for manifesting arts of all kinds, not least painting. And for a ruler of countries characterized by enormous areas and natural resources of different kinds, landscape painting was to serve an important function. Motifs of dramatic mountains and endless vistas literally represented the vastness of the territory. And I will get back to this. So, Fahlcrantz got his first training with a decorative painter at the theatre, this can be seen as part of the foundation of his artistry. I think this is an interesting parallel in relation to Balke, who was an apprentice on the same premises with Jens Funk. I will get back to this, but it is likely that this background is important to consider when studying the technique of both Fahlcrantz and Balke. Technically, both can be characterized as rational painters, adopting economic painterly solution closely related to, for example, stage sets. After the apprenticeship with Limnell, this is a sketch by Limnell for a stage set in the collection of the National Museum in Stockholm. After the apprenticeship with Limnell, Fahlcrantz attended the Academy of Art in Stockholm. Apart from his training there, it is likely that he was strongly influenced by Elias Martin, who dominated landscape painting in Sweden since almost half a century. Martin had spent 2 longer periods in England, taking strong impressions of landscape painting there. I think it is quite interesting to consider his romantic landscape with Spruce, as you see here. It was painted around 1780 as Martin returned from England to Sweden. And for the remaining decades of his life, he died in 1818. He would continue to paint landscapes, although more often he would arrange them less dramatically and more towards the archaic. Now we are getting closer to Fahlcrantz. I think this is quite interesting as it provides Swedish early 19th century art with a kind of DNA, an English one that is, that was not imported in the same way into, for example, Denmark. And even more interesting is that it survived as long as it did. Throughout his artistic life, Fahlcrantz maintained, to some extent, this Martinesque English tone, and thereby I think it is not completely crazy to consider there to be a little of this also in Balke's art. I will get back to this. Now finally, Fahlcrantz. What about Fahlcrantz's position at the Swedish art scene? During the first decade of the 19th century, he was making a name for himself through painting a kind of fantasy or capriccio landscapes, like this one from 1809. Around 1810, he had made quite a name for himself, and commissions increased steadily. And rather than capriccios or fantasy landscapes, these were actual landscapes, like this view from the Royal Garden of Haga, north of Stockholm city center. It was painted in 1811. And something interesting is that in relation to this painting, Fahlcrantz painted oil sketches on plein air, making him an early adopter of this practice in a Swedish context. How was Fahlcrantz considered among intellectuals? There is quite an extraordinary passage in the diary of Per Daniel Amadeus Atterbom from his travels in Germany and Italy. Atterbom was one of the leading Swedish romantics, a writer and critic and professor at the university in Uppsala. Atterbom traveled to Germany and Italy between 1817 and 1819. And in relation to visiting Caspar David Friedrich in Dresden, he writes, "The fact that Fahlcrantz is not familiar among people here makes me angry. Perhaps a landscape painter like him does not exist here. Friedrich, with whom I'm happy to socialize, has seen a couple of works by our Claude Lorrain of the North, that is Fahlcrantz. He praised the tendency and the soul of the paintings, but remarked on the way they were executed. It is possible that Friedrich saw older and less significant works by Fahlcrantz, or that he, who is a kind of metaphysicus equipped with a brush, did not find enough symbolic Bedeutung or meaning invested into them. We may smile at this juxtaposition today, but one must remind oneself that at this time the painting or the work of art was to a higher, in particular a landscape painting, was to a higher extent considered a vehicle for the beholder to use, to get in touch with the spirit of nature and one's own imagination. In many ways, Friedrich is of course Fahlcrantz's superior, particularly when it comes to execution, but both artists' paintings may very well have been able to serve an identical purpose to its beholders. And one can conclude that Friedrich criticism is more about taste than it is about the substance or sincerity of Fahlcrantz's intentions. In relation to this, it is relevant to take into consideration that Fahlcrantz did not travel abroad until quite late in his life. Thus, his conditions for collecting impressions and influence from contemporary art were different or worse than most others. Already in 1805, he was granted financial support for traveling the original intention was to travel south, but upon his own request, he was allowed to use the funds for traveling within the country's borders. That was his own choice. It was not until 1827 that he traveled abroad for the first of only 2 times. Then he traveled to Norway. And here we are getting closer to his and Balke's relationship. Why did he go to Norway? The answer is probably very simple, or Marit suggested that it could be very complex. I will focus on the most simple answer, and the more dramatic and even more beautiful sceneries of Norway became an important way to rejuvenate Swedish romanticism, and motifs from Norway were asked for by the court. It was about when he returned to Sweden that Peder Balke traveled to Stockholm and became his student. It is not very well known how their relationship looked in detail, and there are very few traces of their painting or practicing together. However, there is one possible example that at least could serve as a ground for theories. And I managed to forget to change images, but this is when Fahlcrantz is at the height of his artistry, one might say. This is a motif from Uppsala. I will get back to that one later. And this is a motif from Norway. These 2 paintings are almost identical, but one of them is supposed to be by Balke, according to a text on the stretcher. It's the left one. And the other one is by Fahlcrantz in the collection of the National Museum in Stockholm. The motif has been identified as a place just south of Stockholm thanks to the text on the Balke stretcher. One alternative would be, which, as you know, was common at this time, that the artists had painted after nature side by side. Although the right one, the Fahlcrantz, is a bit too finished for him to have been painted en plein air. His oil sketches, they look entirely different. And the left one, supposed to be by Balke, is way too similar to give the impression of an independent work. The most likely thing would be that Balke has painted a copy after Fahlcrantz. If it is not the work by Fahlcrantz himself, that's possible also, since they are really close to each other. If it is Balke, the 2 works tell us something about Fahlcrantz's professorship. It is interesting to compare this painting to the left with an independent work by Balke from the same time, Carl-Johan's Klev, which is very different and a lot less mature, judging by the brushwork only. Maybe it would not be too daring to see this as a possible indication that Fahlcrantz was very important for Balke in the technical aspect, that Balke copied Fahlcrantz, like, for example, Dahl copied old masters in Copenhagen. I think that technically there are resemblances even with the mature painting of Balke, like in the magnificent view of Stockholm, when you compare it to Fahlcrantz's view of Uppsala. I'm just going to, like that. I should have put them together, of course. The economical, rational brushwork and the scale of colors, so important for this atmosphere associated with both the artists. Although Balke has developed this technique into an even simpler, yet more refined way of rendering, for example, buildings and water. I'll just here. I think I didn't manage to do it justice. I was in the exhibition yesterday and I took some photographs myself, but it's more striking in real life. If we consider Fahlcrantz work in a broader romantic context, what can be said about, so to say, standard features of romantic painting, such as distance, romanticization in Novalis sense, and religious dimensions? Interestingly enough, Fahlcrantz does not seem to have been very dependent of any of these features. Rather, his landscapes make a kind of confined, closed scene, forcing the beholder to take in the silent drama in the room immediately in front of him or her, instead of light in the distance tempting the beholder beyond the horizon. There is often darkness approaching in quite an uncomfortable way. I think this is something he has in common with Peder Balke, whether an influence from professor on student or not. This also makes me see the English connection that I was referring to before, to Thomas Gainsborough, for example, via Elias Martin, and resulting in this brownish-toned, not entirely pleasing landscapes. Friedrich or Dahl do not adopt the same level of sublime quality or strength, but rather let the beholder explore the landscape in a less disturbing way. I would like to end by mentioning that Carl-Johan Fahlcrantz, he was an honorary member of the Art Academy of New York, and I don't know if that has something to do with the Hudson School, maybe. There are quite striking similarities between some of his paintings and the paintings of the Hudson River School. Thank you very much.